Is BBC World. The clerks and scribes of the Middle Ages who practiced the art of writing pioneered a medium which would become the very foundation of civilization. Yet for many centuries, access to the written word was confined to the very few. The illuminated manuscripts in the Middle Ages were priceless. One had the value of a farm. Scholars wishing to study had to come to places like this and to get past an attendant priesthood. 3 canons with separate keys were needed to open the high security chests where books were kept at Hereford Cathedral. After printing was introduced, books remained large and expensive. It seemed unlikely they would ever become available to a wider public.
The latest technology that came in at the end of the 16th century was the idea of the chained library, whereby books could be instantly accessible to anybody who visited the library, and by simply extracting a book with the chain just long enough for the book to be lowered from the case onto the desk in front of the reader. And there the person could study the book as much as they wanted, with no fear of them being able to remove it.
For books to become generally available, they would have to lose their chains and become smaller and more affordable. Today, books are everywhere, written in hundreds of languages, about thousands of subjects. Once the exclusive property of a small, educated class, they have become the foundation of modern culture. In the past few years, a competitor to the book has begun rooting itself in the culture of the young. But when the ancestors of the modern computer first appeared, they too were fabulously expensive, and they too were in the hands of a mathematical priesthood. 45 years ago, the idea that computers would ever play a popular role seemed even less likely than that illuminated manuscripts could lead to the paperback book.
Even mathematicians found computers very difficult to use. They had to prepare their programs in the arcane language of the computer, punch them onto tape or cards, and bring them to a computer center to be run, and it rarely worked first time.
Say, what's going on here? Something must be wrong with the oscilloscope.
I found programming on the old big machines to be unbelievably frustrating, and I used to get really angry about it because I couldn't understand why the things weren't easier to use.
I think it was bleak. A human being having to punch holes in lots of cards and keep these cards all straight, and then take this deck of what might be hundreds and hundreds of cards to a computer, and you go away and you come back the next day and find out that your program executed up until card 433, and then it stopped because you left out a comma. So you take your deck of cards, and you go back and you fix that, and you go back to the computer again, and this time the program got to card 4006, and it stopped because you forgot to punch a O instead of a 0 or some other stupid reason. I think it was bleak. I think it was dehumanizing.
A group of Stanford students filmed their experience, perhaps a little exaggerated. If programmers were driven to suicide by computers, what chance was there for ordinary people ever to use them? Yet within a few decades, the image of the computer would change. Like the book, it would get smaller, cheaper, and become so easy to use that millions would become literate in the new medium.
We're going to show you a man actually talking to a computer in a way far different than it's ever been possible to do before.
Surely not with his voice.
No, he's going to be talking graphically. He's going to be drawing, and the computer is going to understand his drawings. And the man will be using a language, a graphical language that we call Sketchpad, that started with Ivan Sutherland some years ago when he was busy working on his doctoral degree.
In an era when almost everybody thought that computers were only for crunching numbers, a young graduate student, Ivan Sutherland, had used clever software to make the computer manipulate engineering drawings. With Sketchpad, Sutherland had created the field of computer graphics, and almost 30 years ago demonstrated the power of a whole new way of talking to the computer, interactive computing. But would anybody listen?
We were off to a fabulous start in 1960 with Ivan Sutherland's Sketchpad, one of the most extraordinary programs ever written. And the amazing thing to me is that this did not start a vast movement. In fact, it just stood there as an example that people would gaze at. They'd look at the movie and say, yeah, gee, well, that's very inspirational. And then they'd go back and do exactly what they were doing, which had nothing to do with interactive computing, because there wasn't any interactive computing.
If every one of us does our job well, it'll all go very interesting, I think.
A few years later, another visionary, Doug Engelbart, appealed to his colleagues to change the way they thought about computers. In a spectacular demonstration, he showed off a series of brilliant innovations, including a pointing device called a mouse.
I don't know why we call it a mouse. Sometimes I apologize. It started that way, and we never did change it.
Doug Engelbart is the single most important person in the history of computing. And it's shocking how few people have actually heard of him. It would be as if we all use electricity and light bulbs, but nobody had heard of Thomas Edison.
25 years later, Doug Engelbart walks unrecognized on the Stanford campus. His bold gamble didn't come off.
We just thought, boy, then within a year or two, there'll be all sorts of people joining this pursuit, and it become more of an acceptable activity. And, it seemed to, and what I hear from various places is that it stimulated and motivated some people, but it didn't seem to connect us to something that was a viable strand of pursuit for people to pick up, and it just didn't.
Commercial computer makers were slow to see that computers might become a tool for ordinary people, and just didn't get the point of what Engelbart and Sutherland were saying.
Because the establishment never gets it. That's how it is with paradigm shift. The establishment does not see where the next wave is coming from. And even if they hire somebody to tell them where the next wave is coming from, they never believe them, which is exactly what happened with XEROX and XEROX Parc.
One of the implications of Engelbart's demonstration was paperless communication. And that did not go unnoticed in one quarter.
Thank you, Debbie. That was fast. Which is the original?
I forget.
You've just seen the XEROX 9.
The Xerox Corporation owed its prosperity to paper copying. If one day paper was to be outdated, then they wanted to be part of the new electronic world. So, in a visionary act, they set up a research center at Palo Alto in California. XEROX Parc, and they agreed to fund it for 10 years.
This is about 6 microns thick. As a function of spatial frequency,
they gathered together the brightest young computer scientists they could find and gave them a challenge: make computers easier to use.
The reason that most of us went to work there was that we felt that this would be an opportunity to bring computing to everyone. Remember, a computer at that time was thought of as something that was very forbidding, difficult, highly technological. You had to be a real expert and a doctorate to understand. That was kind of the public image. And we somehow had to humanize computers and make them a common object that anyone could use.
In the years ahead, this unconventional group of young scientists sought a different way of interacting with a computer. But they knew they had far too much technical knowledge to understand the problems of the ordinary user.
Technical people live in this tiny little world, actually. We like to think it's a big world, but it's actually a tiny little world. And it's full of phrases that we learned when we were taking math classes. And it's hermetic. And it's full of people who like to learn complicated things. They delight in it. And so what you need to have is some way of constantly shocking yourself into realizing that the users are not like us. And children do it really well, because they don't care about the same kinds of things that adults do, and they can always go out and play ball. They haven't learned to feel guilty about not working yet. It forced us to start thinking about how human mentalities might work.
The key to making computers easy to use lay in the way children learned. By observing children growing up, psychologists have seen that at different stages, children perceive the world in quite different ways. Very young children explore the world through touch, reaching and grabbing objects. For children of 5 or 6, the visual mentality is more important. The Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget had shown just how strong it was in a series of classic experiments.
Well, Dr. Inhelder here is filling one glass with milk. Then she's asking the child to fill his with exactly the same amount as she has in hers.
For children like this 5-year-old, the visual mentality is so dominant that they may be led into error. Here, the child has to decide whether 2 glasses have the same amount of milk in them. After the child is happy that the 2 glasses contain equal amounts, the investigator makes her move.
I would prefer to drink my milk in the tall glass. I have poured it all in the tall glass. You and I, have we still the same amount?
No.
Who has more? In this glass? But how do you know? Because it is taller.
Later on, we learn to handle symbolic reasoning with difficulty.
In such a way that they're understandable to us. I can't hear you, Monty.
Many people find things like algebra confusing. It's not surprising that they had found the symbolic language of computers impossible. But the intuitive mentalities of touch and vision stay with us all our lives. We are all expert at seeing something, reaching out and grabbing it. The XEROX scientists realized that this was the key to making computers easy to use. By programming the computer to control the elements of a television screen, they created an illusion of a paper-like surface on which pictures could be drawn and animated. Doug Engelbart's mouse was the perfect manipulative device. It fitted into the hand, and with it one could reach out and grab objects on the screen and move them around. Sophisticated software enabled the unfriendly computer to simulate a world the user already understood. This paint program from 1972 made the act of painting on a computer remarkably similar to painting in the real world. Other software enabled letters to be formed, or music to be written and transcribed. Software apparently could change the computer from a forbidding machine into a friendly mental tool.
What we realized was that we could create what some people called a user illusion, something that appeared to be a world on a screen. One way to think about it is if you play a video game, there's an illusion of spaceships or of roads and cars, or depending on the kind of game. And the user who gets engrossed in the game starts operating as if they're really working in the real world, when in fact they're only working in this imaginary simulated world created by the sequence of steps in the computer program. So what we realized was that we could create an illusion, for example, of an office with folders and documents and file cabinets in the office, and that instead of having the user learn complicated and unfamiliar technological terms, we could use the metaphor of the office, for example, and talk about opening files and closing files and editing documents and other terms that were much more familiar to people.
By the early 70s, Xerox scientists with their Alto office system had demonstrated the future. But at $45,000 a time, few users could afford it. This was one reason why Xerox decided not to market it.
The reason no one's heard of it is because it wasn't made into a successful product. Now, are you asking why wasn't it made into a successful product? The short answer is that that research was done in the context of a copier company, not a computer company.
And when it came down to it, this copier company was not ready to launch headlong into the personal computer revolution. By itself, the brilliant work of Xerox Parc wasn't enough to change the world of computing. Before the computer would become commonplace, it had to become smaller and cheaper.
A few miles from Xerox Parc in Silicon Valley, the electronics capital of the world, a revolution was underway. Each year, engineers vied with each other to stuff more and more electronic circuitry onto tiny wafers of silicon. Computers which once filled a room had been squeezed into boxes the size of refrigerators. And in 1970, the silicon wizards had gone a step further, putting the main circuitry of a computer on a chip which could be mass-produced. The microprocessor could totally change the economics of computing. Computers need no longer be priceless objects. Microprocessors, if mass-produced, could become cheap enough to be disposable.
I had one case where I was being interviewed by somebody from a magazine who kept asking questions about testing. But I realized after this questioning went on for a while that they weren't really talking about testing, they were talking about repair. And they had the idea that somehow somebody was going to have to take their soldering iron and go down inside the chip and try to move wires around. And then once I realized what they were really asking, I said, oh no, it's not like that at all. It's like a light bulb. When it burns out, you unplug it and you throw it in the garbage and plug in a new one. And they were just dumbfounded at the idea that a computer could be so inexpensive you'd think about throwing it away.
I was on a panel with a couple of other people from large computer companies, and we're talking about the prospects for the microprocessor. One of the other panelists said, I wouldn't want to have my computer such that if I dropped it on the floor, it would fall in a crack and I'd lose it. And I said, you don't understand. If you can drop it in a crack and lose it, there's millions more where that came from.
In the mid-70s, corporate giants like IBM weren't convinced that a real mass market in computers would ever exist. Unaware of the brilliant work of Xerox Parc, they saw their customers as limited to scientific and business institutions. But there was a group who desperately wanted their own computers. People who'd grown up on the fringes of the computer establishment. Technical hobbyists who'd used computers at universities and knew their remarkable versatility. Before the microprocessor, their dreams seemed absurd. Now, perhaps things would change. In January 1975, the front cover of Popular Electronics featured a computer kit called the Altair for the unheard-of price of $500. Based on a microprocessor, you had to assemble it yourself. And when assembled, it did almost nothing. If people did want to own their computer, here, finally, was the opportunity.
And what happened was all this pent-up demand, a sort of latent understanding everybody had of what computers could do, suddenly was allowed to burst forth. People drove all night to get their computer kits. Why do people read the popular mechanics magazines because they dream of all the things they could do if. And suddenly here was a new if. If only I had this computer, I could keep track of everything, I could learn everything, I could be creative in every possible way. And so it began.
For technical hobbyists, it was a dream come true. Now they could have their own computer. Clubs of enthusiasts grew up all over America, like the Homebrew Computer Club in San Francisco, where members showed off what they'd got their home-brewed computers to do. From these modest beginnings came a series of start-up companies selling parts for the Altair, and soon whole computers. By 1976, there were enough of them to hold a convention in Atlantic City. Off in a corner of the convention hall were a group of scruffy-looking individuals selling circuit boards. Two of them would become synonymous with the personal computer, Steve Jobs and Stephen Wozniak. As teenagers growing up in Silicon Valley, Jobs and Wozniak had developed reputations as high-tech pranksters, all too eager to thumb their noses at authority.
Woz and I had known each other since I was about 12 or 13 years old. And our first project together was we built these little blue boxes to make free telephone calls. And we had the best blue box in the world. It was this all digital little blue box. I don't think it works anymore, so. But we had a fun time doing that. So when it came to building a computer together, Woz was the brilliant hardware engineer and focused on the core design of the computer. And I was worrying about which parts we ought to use and how we were going to build these things and how somebody that wasn't a Woz was going to manage to buy all the extra parts you still needed to buy and plug this thing together.
So I was not designing a computer with any idea we'd ever start a company, ever have a product, ever be successful. It was just to go down to the club and show off and to own and use. Steve saw the interest, and he started coming up with ideas right away how this thing could be turned into product, how it could be marketed.
The two Steves, however, knew little about running a business. Their ambitions might have come to nothing had they not decided to go to Mike Markler and ask for help. Markler was a retired Intel executive who liked helping young entrepreneurs. When he saw the computer they were building, the Apple, he was entranced.
And I looked at it and I said, this is the first affordable, useful computer for people. And the two guys really didn't have the background and experience to start a company and make it successful. So I agreed to help them.
What happened next is the stuff of legend. The story of Jobs and Wozniak and the rise of Apple computers is the American dream writ large. For the seeds the hobbyists had planted grew quickly into a huge microcomputer industry. Contrary to the expectations of the corporate establishment, people did apparently want to own their own computers, although it wasn't clear exactly why they wanted them. Some used them for games, and later scientific and business uses were found. But whatever the reason, people seemed to want to own them. While many of the start-up companies folded in this turbulent market, under Markler's careful management, Apple prospered, becoming the fastest-growing company in history. Jobs, Wozniak and Markler became rich beyond their dreams. Each ended up with more than $100 million. The computer, once an expensive, room-sized machine, was now coming off the assembly line by the thousand. An idea which a decade before would have sounded like science fiction.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to the Hobby Computer Club. I notice there are a number of faces here that we haven't seen before.
Britain too had its hobbyists from every walk of life, all passionate about computers. The potential of the market appealed to one of Britain's more unconventional inventors.
Well, it was a new market which was dominated by the Americans, and where clearly, if the cost could be reduced substantially, the market could be expanded.
Clive Sinclair was well known for a succession of cheap, miniaturized electronic gadgets, from tiny televisions to pocket calculators. In 1980, Sinclair launched his first computer. It could be bought for £100, less if purchased as a kit, and it plugged into any television. Programs were sold on cassettes, playable by a cheap cassette recorder. Sinclair's computers took over most of the British market, and for a short time, even in America, he was selling more machines than the three market leaders put together. They turned up everywhere.
There's a large number of people applying them in all sorts of ways that are unsuspected. I got into a London taxi the other day, had one of our computers built in, and you gave him any destination, and he could tap it in and tell you what the cost would be.
All the time that newcomers like Sinclair and Apple had been building the new personal computer industry, IBM, the industry giant, had been sitting on the sidelines watching. At first, they weren't sure how to respond to this strange new market. And when they did make a half-hearted attempt to enter the field, they failed.
IBM put out a personal computer in 1975. People don't know this because they don't talk about it very much. The 5100. They called it the portable computer. It weighed 30 pounds. It was big as a bread box, had a 5-inch screen, could cost $5,000 just to open the box and $9,000 if you wanted it to really do anything. They were selling this at the second West Coast Computer Fair, all dressed up in nice little IBM suits, and they weren't doing much business. The guy next door to them, who had a propeller beanie on, a total freak named Lyle Morrow, was doing land office business selling his disks of What's It software, as it was called, a little database program. And perhaps they learned something from that.
Today, a new IBM computer has reached a personal scale. A person can afford it. A person can put it anywhere. Office.
In 1981, IBM saw the light and introduced a serious personal computer. Soon they dominated the market that others had created. Despite the astonishing growth of the microcomputer industry, there were problems. Computers were now small and affordable, but they were still infuriatingly difficult to use.
If you can't get a computer to do anything but frustrate you, if you're having a hard time understanding computers,
what the PC revolution needed had been invented a decade before at XEROX Parc, software which made a computer easy enough for a child to use. XEROX had failed to commercialize its great discoveries. It would be up to someone else to deliver the Parc vision to the world. That person was Steve Jobs. One day in 1979, he visited the laboratories at Parc and he was astonished at what he saw.
And it was just instantly obvious to anyone that this was the way things should be. And so I remember coming back to Apple thinking, our future has just changed. This is where we have to go.
The vision of XEROX Parc now became Steve Jobs' vision as well. His challenge was to build a computer which was not only cheap and small, but so intuitive a child could use it. Such a computer might not only change the course of computing, but prevent the mighty IBM from dominating the PC industry. The launch date for his new product, the Machintosh, was January 1984. And in an impassioned speech to his salesman, Jobs couldn't resist invoking the name of George Orwell.
It is now 1984. It appears IBM wants it all. IBM wants it all and is aiming its guns on its last obstacle to industry control, Apple. Will Big Blue dominate the entire computer industry, the entire information age? Was George Orwell right about 1984?
In a daring and controversial commercial which attracted the attention of news media all over the world, Jobs created an image of desperate computer users being brainwashed by Big Brother, a veiled reference to IBM. But they were about to be awakened from their slumber by the winds of free personal interactive computing.
We are one people, with one will, one resolve.
For the brilliant ideas of the Xerox Parc scientists, their time had come.
We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Machintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
The Macintosh marked the beginning of a new era of computing. Gone are the arcane symbols. Instead, using a mouse, a person pushes and pulls pictures using the intuitive skills learned in childhood. The computer screen, with its pictures and icons, depicts a familiar world that even a child can understand. In reality, this friendly graphical illusion is conjured up by thousands of lines of complex code written by computer programmers. This code, in turn, is converted into hundreds of even more basic orders which this computer knows how to follow. The computer's circuits, millions of simple switches, blindly obey, opening and closing millions of times a second. If software can transform the look and feel for one computer, then it could, in principle, do it for all computers, even the unfriendly ones, like this one.
So if I want to copy a file, for instance, I have to know what the meaning of a:\\, this, that, and the other thing is. And if I mistype a single character, then it will give me some sort of obscure error message. Here I got one that says, not ready error, reading drive A, abort, retry, fail. It's kind of cryptic and it's certainly not very friendly. It's a typical old style interface. The interesting thing is that simply by changing the software, not the hardware, exact same hardware, an environment can be built that is much simpler, much friendlier, much more graphical. And I'm going to bring that up right now. We'll take a look at it. I have a pointer that I can move around on the screen. I've got a mouse here. I can click on that to make things happen. The same exact machine, but given different software, it creates an entirely different style of interacting with it.
Now all computers could be friendly. They could begin to realize their destiny as universal machines. Powerful computers, which once filled a room and cost a small fortune, now fitted on a desk. Once the exclusive tool of skilled programmers, computers were increasingly simple to use. Now it was up to individuals to decide what to use them for. Computers could be used for arithmetic, but different software could turn the same computer hardware into a drawing machine. Simple commands could scale, rotate, or color a drawing, producing in seconds what would have taken a skilled draftsman hours of work. Different software in the same machine turned it into a musician's studio. Still other software could turn the computer into a flight simulator. The uses of a universal machine are bound only by the imagination of the user, and it now stretched from scientists creating the future to classical scholars seeking a better way of searching and analyzing the literature of the past. The machine invented to compute numbers would now less and less be seen as having anything to do with arithmetic. The computer was a lever of the mind which empowered individuals in whatever field to do new things.
We call them computers because historically we just happened to use them first for numbers. They could have been used first for controlling moving signs like baseball scoreboards, in which case we wouldn't have thought of them as numerical. We would have thought of them as textual and graphical machines first and then recognized their numerical functions afterward. So it's a historical accident that they're called computers, and this has misled a lot of people. What they really are is all-purpose machines that can be turned to any purpose by instructing them, which doesn't mean saying, now computer, you do this. It means thinking of a series of operations and a way of specifying those operations that will make the events occur that you want to occur. And that sounds so simple.
Laura, a child of a new computer era, is blissfully unaware of how a computer works and how it's programmed. Born the year of the Mac, she found the objects in her world included not only pets, people and toys, but friendly computers. Her father took this extraordinary film when she was only 18 months old. Although she can't talk properly and cannot begin to read, she is essentially computer literate.
Want to make a ball? Oh, where's the ball? Laura, let's make a ball. There's the ball. We're making, very nice. Want to make a white
The
ball?
computer, once the specialized tool of scientists and businessmen, has established itself in the culture of the young.
What is a computer? If someone knows nothing about it, what would you tell them a computer is? What would you say? Kim?
Well, a computer is something that you write on and press buttons on.
All right, so it's something that you can write with. What else can we do with computers?
Make designs.
How do we make designs on the computer?
Well, you press some buttons and then you can make a design. Something that's like a TV and you could make
Look at me,
pictures with it and it helps you to read.
For a new generation of children, the computer was a familiar object in their world. And not knowing anything of its history as a room-sized number cruncher, they had their own image of what it was for.
That's okay.
How it worked was of no interest to them. What mattered was what it could empower them to do. Since the computer mediated things like drawing, writing, reading, they saw it as a medium of expression more like a pencil and paper than a machine. For these children, the computer isn't just a new means of expression, it's the only one. For it offers them a lifeline to a universe of thought and learning previously denied them. These children, who are physically and learning disabled, have one thing in common. The traditional medium for representing ideas, the book, is largely unavailable to them.
Print materials are like stairs. Print materials are inaccessible to a lot of kids. Kids who can't turn pages, can't hold a book. Kids with dyslexia who can't read words. Kids who can't hold a pencil or who can't spell or whose handwriting is very poor.
Look, I tried something new, though. I got a new...
If print materials are like stairs, then the computer can be thought of as a mental ramp, which gives children access to a world of ideas from which they have been excluded.
Sound effect, and these are your choices. That reads it.
Matthew Huggins is a very intelligent 7-year-old. Because he was born with cerebral palsy, he is unable to control most of his muscles, unable to open a book or turn its pages, unable to speak his thoughts and ideas. His keen intelligence is trapped inside an unresponsive body.
Pan Am. Yes? I know what you're doing. You're finding out if they went on TWA, right? Am I right? Yes, I thought so.
A few years ago, Matthew's only hope would have been to be sent to a special school. But by taking advantage of the computer's remarkable versatility, he's able to attend an ordinary school with other children his age. The same books that other children can open and turn can be scanned into a computer where he can control the page turns with his chin. The computer has unlocked the world of ideas and made it available to Matthew in a form he can use.
When you have someone like Matthew, who essentially, his motor system is not going to work. He can't be an athlete, but he could be an architect, a musician. And the computer has become something that really can offer almost anything to anyone.
I would want to be a captain in the army, especially to fly a copter or a plane with IJs. And I would give pizza to my men, and I would change the course of the world.
Something that you write
A
on
remarkable
and-
thing has happened. Children of Matthew's generation have worked out what most computer users are unable to see. The computer isn't really a machine at all, but a new medium. It shows signs of becoming as important to our developing culture as the book before it. But the process of acceptance, which took the book hundreds of years, has some way to go. Computers are still very valuable and cherished objects. As with the priceless books of past ages, university libraries chain them in to prevent them being stolen. The destiny of this new medium is hard to guess, but computer manufacturers are not hesitant in coming forward with their visions. It is a world where computers are much smaller and more powerful, where we interact with them by speech.
Let's see noise test 3 again. Okay, change the
A world where computers are completely taken for granted.
When volcanoes erupt, magma comes out through the cracks in the Earth's crust, and the cracks are called fissures. I knew that.
What's it really look like?
This is what a volcanic eruption looks like in real life.
But others see grander opportunities still, because unlike other media, the computer is not confined to 2 dimensions.
This is a head-mounted display, which consists of a pair of small TV displays connected to a helmet and a small tracking system, which allows the computer to determine where the helmet is in position and orientation at every instant. And using these 2 technologies, we can program computers to give the feeling to the user who's wearing this of being immersed in the computer-simulated environment. So instead of looking at the computer-generated image on a standard TV set on a tabletop, we're inside that world. And instead of walking through the world by knobs and buttons and rotators, we're able to just walk through the world by looking around. And so this particular application is one in which we are walking around a church addition that was being planned here a couple of years ago. And the effect is so powerful because you are doing those actions which are intuitive for you all your life. This looks very nice. I think I want to go into the hall itself. You could look around in here also. I'll look up at the pattern of lights on the ceiling. I like these nice circular windows on each end.
Two years before this building was completed, people had walked through it. They'd looked at its columns, they'd walked inside it, and gazed at its windows. Through a powerful illusion of computer software, they'd grasped the reality of what an unbuilt building looked like. But architecture is only one of many possible virtual worlds.
And over on the right is a small molecule called methotrexate, which is one of the inhibitors for this molecule, so that I can move it in space. I can bring it over near the enzyme, and also I can turn and twist it, and I can walk it inside this cavity. Now I let it go inside the cavity. I can go in and stick my head right in the middle of it. I'm back in the active site now, and you can go right through and come out the other side. It feels a little strange. Of course, you don't feel the molecule. You don't actually bump into it, but it seems that way.
At the moment, the illusions strain the limits of what computer hardware can manage. Every time the user moves, millions of computations have to be done to update the image. But things are improving all the time.
Right, you see, I'm walking right in space. You see, I'm looking down right on top of this right now.
With virtual worlds, we get to experience our thoughts. We see them, we walk through them. In the future, touch feedback will be added, and we'll feel our thoughts as well. Continuing in a tradition which began with writing, where virtual reality will lead, no one can tell.
I think that the switch from 2D to 3D is tremendously exciting. Because in one sense, 2D is what we have been doing with intellectual activities for centuries. It is what we write, it is what we read, it is the pictures that we see on the walls, it is the way we communicate with people. On the other hand, 3D is where we live all the time. Our everyday life is three-dimensional. And so I believe that as soon as the computers become capable of being able to interact with the users in 3 dimensions, that the more natural interface will be a 3D one.